Hi, and welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on this podcast, we're going to continue talking about the long run average total cost curve. And one of the things that we want to say here real fast is that the long run average total cost curve is always going to have this general shape of decreasing long run average total cost, followed by some constant returns, followed by diseconomies of scale. However, not all the curves have to look like this nice, neat, symmetrical thing that I have drawn here. They can have very different looks to them. And I just want to highlight two possibilities and talk about what it means to have different shapes on the long-run average total cost curve. So let's take a look at some examples. So first of all, I keep doing this. We're looking at an individual firm, which means we're not using a capital Q, we're using a lowercase q to indicate that this is an individual firm. And then I would say, what does it mean if the long-run average total cost curve, let's say, looks like this? What does this mean if the long-run average total cost curve looks something like that? So if you have a long-run average total cost curve that looks like this, first of all, it follows the normal shape of a long-run average total cost curve. It goes down, hits a minimum, and then rises. That's your normal long-run average total cost curve. But the question that we would ask, and there'd be two questions that we would ask about this. The questions would be, one, are the firms in this industry going to be large or small? And so that is to say, what can we say about the size of the firm? And then the second question is, how many firms do we think will be in the industry? So that is to say, what are the number of firms? Will there be many firms or few firms? And that will be dictated by what the long-run average total cost curve looks like. So if the long-run average total cost curve looks like this, then we could say in order to be competitive, in order to be cost competitive, a firm would have to be very small. Why do I say that? Because in order to keep their costs low, they would have to produce down here at a relatively low level of production. Okay, you couldn't produce up here at very large levels of production because your costs would just be prohibitive. They'd be way too high in order to be competitive. So your size of the firm is going to be relatively small. You're going to have relatively small firms. So an example of this might be, in a lot of places around the country, especially more rural areas, you might have a lot of little fruit stands. So you might have a grocery store that sells fruit, and then you might have some places that specialize in selling fruit. That's all they do. Maybe it's a little like fruit stand or something like that, and so there could be lots of these little fruit stands, and they could be all over. Some of them be a little bigger and would almost be like a little company almost, and some of them would just be some farmer just maybe he's got his kids stand alongside the road and they're selling corn or selling tomatoes or watermelons or whatever the case might be, and so those firms, they'd be very, very small, very, very small firms, producing at very, very low levels, and that is cost effective for those like this. What I describe, these little fruit stands, they're very small, very low cost, and so as a result of that, there could be a very large number of them. There'd be a large number of these firms, all producing in very, very small amounts in order to keep their costs low. Okay, so that's what one long-run average total cost curve could look like. And by the way, the reason why the firms are small and the reason why they keep their costs low by producing at low levels is because there's a lot of diseconomies that we talked about before. There's a lot of diseconomies to scale. There's a lot of diseconomies to scale. Okay? And so that's why they would produce at very low levels, and there'd be small firms and a large number of them. That'd be the reason for it. Now, at the other extreme, you could have this. You could have maybe this, where, okay, let's change this to lowercase q again as an individual firm, and maybe a long-run average total cost curve could look like this. Okay, this also conforms with our general nature of a long-run average total cost curve. It declines, hits a minimum, and then rises, and that's our long-run average total cost. But now for this industry, we ask the same questions again. What can we say about the size of the firm under these conditions, and what can we say about the number of the firms. How many firms will there be? And so the first thing that we can see is that in order to keep our costs low in this industry, we would have to produce at very high levels of production. Okay, we got to produce at very, very high levels of production. If we tried to produce at low levels of production down here, your costs would be just prohibitively high. You would not be able to compete. Your average cost would just be too high. And so firms will tend to be very, very large. They'll tend to produce at very large levels, very high levels of production. So the size of the firm will be very large. And then we could say the number of firms, as a result of each firm producing at very, very high levels of production, that means that only a small number of firms are going to be able to survive in order to meet the demands of the market, because each one of the firms, there's a small number of firms, but each of them are so large that they're able to meet the demands of the market. So very high levels of production and a very few number of firms. And why is this? This is because they enjoy a lot of economies of scale. Economies of scale. Okay? They enjoy a lot of economies of scale, and that's what allows them to produce at very high levels, drive down their costs, and therefore there will only be a small number of firms in the industry. So I'm just saying this. I'm saying that the long-run average total cost curve can take on a lot of kind of differences in the shapes, but they all have to meet the general principle of going down, hitting a minimum, and then rising. And then the particular shape will change what the industry is going to look like. It's going to change whether or not it's going to be a small or large firms, and it's going to change how many firms can survive in the industry. All right, so this has been another podcast with Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.